Hello. The purpose of this training is to give some background information about education funding in California. My name is Miriam Walden, and an earlier version of this training was developed by my colleague Claudia Vizcarra. Our goal is to focus on the issue of equity throughout. So I should define that term. Equality in education might be regarded as each student getting the same resources. But we all know that some students need more resources in order to achieve the same outcome. An example would be if I assigned an interesting web based activity for my students. Those who don't have internet at home are going to need more resources from the school district in order to achieve the same outcome. And of course, we all know that equal can be inadequate across the board, and that's mostly been our experience of California's education system. That's why I want to start this story in 1967, when education funding was really very different. In fact, California was then in the top 10% in the nation for per student spending. And we had a surplus of qualified teachers, in part because the University of California was tuition free. That really happened. In 1967, our school districts were funded mostly by local property taxes. And that meant that taxes could be increased with just a simple majority vote of the local community. It also meant that up to 90% of the funding for schools was controlled directly by the local elected school board. The system in which there was so much money, though, was really masking a lot of inequality because of generations of racism in our zoning laws, in our housing system, in our banking, in job markets, and in the immigration system. California has really two different kinds of communities where there are more white people, and communities that are more people of color. And because of that same system of racism, those communities are correlated where white communities tend to have higher average incomes, and mostly people of color communities tend to have lower average incomes. There's also a correlation between white communities and high rates of home ownership, between communities of color and lower participation in voting and voter registration. This is the proverbial tracks that divide us. And you can see it in communities like Piedmont versus Oakland, Bellevue versus Marin City, Palo Alto compared with East Palo Alto, or Lammersville compared with Stockton. It also correlates to property values. So imagine a community where property values are such that $52,000 of property value per student in the district. And compare that with a community where property values are $12,000 per student in the district. In that wealthier community, a tax of $2.50 per $100 of property will yield $1,300 per student. Whereas in the lower wealth community, a tax of twice the amount will yield half the results for the students in the district. This fundamentally unfair and racist system was addressed in a lawsuit by Serrano, a man in East LA, against the then treasurer of the state of California, Ivy Priest. And Serrano's argument was that the system of education funding in California is fundamentally unfair. The state Supreme Court agreed with him, and the California state legislature responded. The state Supreme Court said that school funding system is unconstitutional because it discriminates against people who live in communities with less valuable property. The legislature responded with a program called equalization or revenue limits, limiting the funds that wealthy districts could raise to a fixed amount or revenue limit, and then providing state funds for poorer districts to make up the difference to reach that revenue limit. Notice the word equal in equalization. This was not a system of equity. And the implementation of equalization happened in the context of the 1970s and double digit inflation. So property values were going up rapidly, and property taxes were also going up rapidly. This was a problem for our elders living on fixed incomes who found themselves trying to pay property taxes that were much higher than when they bought the house and moved in. Taking advantage of our concern about our seniors, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association launched a campaign for Proposition 13 in 1978 and succeeded in convincing the voters to pass it. Proposition 13 changed our state constitution, revaluing property at its 1975 value until it's sold, limiting annual increases to 2% per year, and changing the voting rules for new taxes to require a two-thirds supermajority. Proposition 13 has numerous effects on our education system. To start with, because property is valued at its 1975 value until it's sold, most of our homes, individual homes, will have been sold several times since 1975 and revalued at more modern property values. But corporations are able to buy and sell, to move property around without actually formally selling it. And the result is that homeowners increasingly are paying the property taxes in our state, and corporations are not. A recent campaign to reform this showed that as much as $12 billion a year is lost to corporations not paying taxes. Unfortunately, that reform effort failed. Proposition 13 also limits the property value increases each year to 2%, even though the state budget is experiencing a growth in population and growth in expenses that is often higher than that. So our state budget becomes increasingly dependent on its revenue from sales taxes and income taxes, which go up and down in times of boom and bust in the economy. And the result is that our school budgets also have surprisingly large deficits one year, followed by one time only surpluses in the next. New taxes must now pass with a two-thirds supermajority. And this means that it's difficult for the state to raise revenue, but not so difficult for the state to put in new tax breaks. As a result, that tax break burden on our state budget, the money that we spend by not raising it, has grown to be about 40% of the size of the visible state budget. And most of that shadow budget goes to wealthy people and big businesses. School districts are mostly affected by the huge reductions in local funding and state funding that came from Prop 13. The state did step in to fill the gap at a local level, but now our funding comes mostly through the state and is based on average daily attendance, or ADA. This is the equalization part. So both the local property taxes and the state funds come through the state on the basis of enrollment. This is very different from city budgets, which are based on the local property taxes and state allowance. Our funding in school districts is entirely based on enrollment. Prop 13 reduced the funding overall, and the state stepped in to fill the gap, but there's still less money in education than there was before. And school boards have less control over the funds than they did before. However, because of equalization, the funding is more equal across school districts. The fact that school districts are in the same boat or similar boat now has made it possible to do organizing at a state level to raise money. An example of this is in 1984. We fought together to implement a lottery system dedicated to the schools. What most people don't realize, though, is that the lottery only contributes 1.5% of our school budgets. In 1988, we passed Prop 98, which guarantees, in a simplified version, that the state will devote at least 40% of its revenues to our K 12 schools. The idea was to stabilize school revenue, but since the state budget is volatile, the Prop 98 allocation also goes up and down. And the current all time high Prop 98 funding is actually just a little bit higher than what it was at its last high peak. It isn't enough funding to meet the needs of our students, and so we worked even harder. For an example is that in 2012, we passed Prop 30, a millionaire's tax devoted to the schools, and then we renewed that in 2016 as Prop 55. But things have continued to become more unequal at our local school districts. An example of how this happens is parcel taxes. Parcel taxes are an exception, a loophole to the Prop 13 regulation. Because they apply as an equal tax on each lot, on each parcel, they're not a property tax per se. And with a two-thirds majority, an individual district can pass a parcel tax that's devoted to the schools. But in a higher wealth district, a $200 per lot tax, for example, might not be such a big burden, and getting a two-thirds yes vote is not so difficult. Where in a lower wealth district, $200 per lot could be a serious burden on families, and reaching that two-thirds yes requirement could be very difficult. Overall, only 10% of school districts in the state of California have been able to pass parcel taxes. Most of those are here in the Bay Area. And even there, there's an incredible disparity between high wealth areas like Piedmont, which have passed parcel taxes 3 times the amount of more diverse and lower income communities in Berkeley and Oakland. Another example of creeping inequality is categorical funding. What happens with categorical funding is that our state legislators want to make a difference in how education happens the same way that you do. So they pass specific laws that dedicate some of those Prop 98 funds for specific purposes. This is money that comes with strings attached, and it often makes our school district leadership and administrators feel like they're tied up. Sometimes the money is dedicated to groups of students that have been historically overlooked, and in that way it's helping equity. But other times, these funds can really have a very unequal effect. An example is class size reduction, legislation that was passed in 1996, with the idea that K through 3 classrooms would be better off with smaller numbers of students because students are learning to read. But at smaller class sizes means that you need more classrooms and you need more teachers. Wealthier school districts were able to raise the bond funds needed to build those new classrooms and accepted the funding from the state. Lower wealth districts were unable to provide new classrooms and accepted less funding. And then experienced teachers in struggling school districts could see that they would get smaller class sizes and nicer classrooms if they moved to other districts. The result is that our lower income school districts were not able to recruit experienced teachers, and those teachers moved to higher income districts. This is compounded by the fact that donations and volunteers are very unequal across our school districts. So, for example, the District of Hillsborough raises through its schools foundation $2,300 per student per year, where in Oakland, the schools foundation raises about $100 per student per year. In 2000, a group of 97 young people, one of them named Williams, sued the state of California, arguing that the education system continued to be unequal. They pointed out that the state was denying the basic tools of a decent education, such as books and heated classrooms, to mostly low income students, immigrant students, and students of color. This fundamental system of unfairness was clear to the state Supreme Court, which ruled in Williams' favor. The governor of California responded by creating a system of standards that dictate how many school books have to be available and how well the classrooms have to be heated and lighted. Um, this set of regulations is then enforced by new community privileges for complaints and for being involved to be involved in school decisions. This is why at your school board you have to approve your annual Williams process and acknowledge Williams complaints. We should talk about charter schools. Whatever you might think about charter schools in terms of the education offered, it's important to pay attention to the financial impacts. You might think that when a student moves from a district school to a charter school, it's a wash financially because the ADA, the per student enrollment funding from the state, is lost at the district level and gained by the charter school, but the district no longer has to educate the student. The fact is, though, that district schools will have teachers, support staff, principals, and other administrators that they can't reduce proportional to the lost students. So, studies have shown that places like Oakland have as much as $1,500 per student in additional losses when a student leaves for a charter school. This doesn't even reflect the cherry picking that can happen when charter schools pick students who come with more resources or push away students who have greater needs. Further, charter schools have a fundamental business problem, which is that it's difficult for them to expand due to lack of buildings and teachers. Leaked financial information from the charter school industry has showed us that they rely on districts to close schools in order for them to acquire buildings and teachers just to reach break even. So the charter school business model may be fundamentally incompatible with public education. You're probably needing some good news right now. So, we have taken steps in California recently towards equity and not just equality in funding. The new local control funding formula, which replaces the revenue limit system, gives each school, each student, a base rate of funding that is equal across the state, and then adds supplemental funding for those students who are foster youth, English learners, or come from low income families. It further adds concentration funds for those schools and districts where students with high needs are the majority of the population. The local control funding formula, which began to be implemented in 2015, does not actually address special education, nor does it address racism directly. Many categoricals have been moved into the local control funding formula, which gives districts greater flexibility. Building out the Williams process, the local control funding formula requires an annual community driven plan called the Local Control Accountability Plan, or LCAP. This presents enormous opportunities for us to organize our communities, but it also looks to school district administrators like a lot of paperwork and a very time consuming process. Supplemental and concentration funds are like categoricals in that they really must be used to address the needs of eligible students. And this is a good thing, but it can also happen that that leads to funding and a focus on special programs instead of basic services and classroom level practices that are important for our high need students. In addition, the California budget system right now is strained by our pension funds. Since the bankruptcy of Enron, the federal government has required all pension funds to be fully funded. A fully funded pension fund is one where the contributions of employees and employers is equal to the amount of pension being paid out. CalSTRS, which is the pension fund for our teaching staff, has never been fully funded, but it's now required to make an effort towards full funding. The result is that rates on the employer, the school district, and teachers have gone up dramatically. And since staffing represents 80% of the budget for our schools, that has a huge impact on our budgets. Keep in mind that teachers don't benefit from the Social Security Administration, so this is their contribution and this is their retirement plan. Both districts and teachers are contributing at rates much higher than the general public contributes to Social Security. The current budget offered by the governor reduces the funding amounts, which will help us in future years, and also stabilizes it. But it's still a lot of money. In case you needed any more problems, along comes COVID 19, which has exposed so much about the inequality in our society. The governor's current 2021-22 budget mostly protects education funding, but we don't know what the impact of COVID 19 will be on our enrollment and our family incomes. Many students have moved out of the district while remaining with us in remote, and families have experienced job loss, which we don't know the full amount of because we haven't seen those applications for free and reduced lunch yet. This will affect our funding, and we just don't know how. There will also be impacts on our staffing as stressed out teachers leave the profession. And there's going to be an unprecedented need for services like mental health, physical health, food services, and education for students who've fallen behind. So, the big picture of our education funding is affected by these legislations: the Serrano v. Priest lawsuit, equalization or revenue limits, which have then been replaced by the local control funding formula, Proposition 13, the lottery and the millionaire's tax, which is currently called Prop 55, Prop 98, which guarantees 40% of the state's budget for K 12 schools, the Williams lawsuit, which specifies certain minimum standards in our schools, and the LCAP process, which guarantees parents and the community involvement in deciding how those local control funding formula funds are spent. Going forward, we still have a very limited budget, and our options, let's name them. We could be advocating for a bigger piece of the state pie to go to education. Many people point to the police budget, the prison budget, as an example of something that could be reformed to the benefit of education. We could be advocating for a bigger pie overall by trying to increase the state's revenue sources, um, revising Prop 13 or other funding initiatives. We could be looking for different pies. For example, we could change the voting rules to make it possible for more individual districts to pass parcel taxes. But this won't address the inequality and the fundamentally regressive nature of parcel taxes. And we can keep focusing on actual pie, our bake sales, and our other fundraising efforts. But what we know about this is that it has very little impact on the inequalities between students, between schools, and between districts. These are some excellent resources that you can go to for more information. I'm really looking forward to talking with you at our next session and hearing your stories and questions. And I thank you for your time today.